every civil war or, conflict between two people ends up becoming, the whole continent goes to war over it. England is able to sort of stay out of the 30 Years' War, but it immediately follows it with its own civil war. So if you think about the 30 Years' War as really, it's a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire, within Germany, that everybody dogpiles on. England has its own similar situation. But England is also, it's just a different animal from the struggles that are going on the continent. And so when pietism does emerge, pietistic movements emerge in England, they take on a somewhat different character that leads to the uniqueness, for example, of Methodism. So I'm going to give you this background just because it'll help in some way. So when we just quick, you remember the history of the Church of England, or maybe you don't, but the Church of England is similar in some ways, that there is a desire for the political powers to have more autonomy from Rome. Now you have to remember the Pope at this time is not only an ecclesial leader, he's also a king. So he's a secular ruler. So you have somebody who's claiming both secular and religious power, exercising some political power in foreign countries. And that causes a lot of tension. This is Henry VIII, a picture of him when he was a young boy, approximately the time he got married, the first time. And there's all this politics going on. And some of you have had church history too. Others, when we have it, we'll go into this in depth in all the gory, salacious detail. In any case, the king wants to get rid of his first wife, who was the wife of his brother, because there is no male heir. And in doing so, he separates the church from the papacy. But he doesn't want to rile up his subjects. So basically nothing changes in doctrine and very little changes in practice. What changes is the political power gets concentrated in the hands of the secular monarch, which means closing all the monasteries. So that's a change. But for your average peasant, closing a monastery doesn't affect you much, because most of them are your lords anyway that you're paying taxes to. So the king closes the monastery, gives the monastery to some friend of his as a noble, and all the lands go with it. So the peasants are just paying their dues to somebody else. It doesn't make much difference to them. And what happens in church, it doesn't make, very little changes, except that the liturgy is in English now, which is popular, as you can imagine. After Henry dies, Edward VI becomes king. He is the wife of Jane Seymour, who is Henry's third wife. And he is very young and sickly. And so Protestant nobles take over, and they institute massive reforms during his reign. Thomas Cranmer being one of the made Archbishop of Canterbury. So they institute Protestant reforms. This is where the first rendition of the Articles of Religion, from which Methodists get their Articles of Religion, comes out. The revised prayer book. But it's very reformed. It's very Calvinist. And in the average, person's church, you have major reforms. So like the stained glass windows that Aunt Nancy donated, they're out. The altar that, 5 generations ago, your people worked hard to save money to pay, it's gone. It's big, all the gold plate, it's out. The altar's gone. We're putting it in. So all these changes. I mean, you can't change the carpet and not cause a small congregational problem. So these were not particularly popular among the average person. He dies very young. He was very sickly, and the person who comes to the throne is Henry's first daughter by Catherine of Aragon, the Princess of Spain, very Roman Catholic, she decides to return the English Church to Roman Catholicism, and that's why she gets the nickname Bloody Mary, because of the numbers of Protestants who are persecuted. Because of her, many Protestants flee to the continent. If you've ever read Fox's Book of Martyrs, or if you've ever heard of Fox's Book of Martyrs, that's written by a refugee to the continent. And what they do is they flee to Geneva, they flee to Strasbourg, they flee to these places where Protestantism, and they see how the church can work in a reformed environment. Geneva in its day was considered, well, it was called a woman's paradise, because you couldn't beat your wife there. It was illegal. You couldn't, the way in which the strictness of the way the church discipline was enforced, for those who already had a kind of pious commitment, this was heaven for them. So these people went, they saw how the church can be ordered and organized in ways that are different from in England, different kinds of hierarchy, etc. In any case, Mary dies without an heir, and many of those folks return. And it is those folks who return who become known as Puritans. The Puritans are those people within the Church of England. So these are Church of England people who are not wanting to leave the Church of England, but they are advocating for a purer church, both in its polity, in the way that it's organized and structured. They want to go back to the Bible. They want to get rid of princely bishops, and they want a worship that is simpler. Not all this, not all these vestments and all this gold stuff and everything. And they also want a pure church in terms of piety.
So they were Anglican?
They are Anglicans. As soon as you stop being Anglican, you become something else. You become a separatist. You're not a Puritan anymore. So Puritans are Anglicans. So the Puritans who came to America, for example, come to America to establish a church and civilization, a city on a hill, if you will, of what a pure Church of England can look like, so that it will be an example to England. So that's what as opposed to the Pilgrims, who were separatists, who came because they didn't want to be a part of the Church of England. So Elizabeth I comes. She is a massive disappointment to the Puritans, even though they come back because she's Protestant, and she's Protestant because she's the daughter of the second wife of Henry, who, of course, if getting rid of his first wife wasn't legitimate, then her mother being she shouldn't be the queen anyway. So she has to be Protestant for political reasons, for no other reason, and not to question her piety. I don't mean that. But in any case, she has this middle way. So she pares down some of the articles of religion. The homilies are still intact. Most of them written by Cranmer. The Book of Common Prayer is altered somewhat to allow for a more, at least a Lutheran, if not even a Catholic understanding of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And so these things, she's trying to shoot the gap, basically. So she's opposed to Puritanism and Catholicism as both too extreme. Now, when she dies without any heir. And the Church of England passes into the hands of James I. James I is the King of Scotland. And by James I taking the crown of both Scotland and England, that's when you begin to have those two countries under one monarch. So Scotland has already, because of the immigrants that have gone to Scotland from Geneva, John Knox, first among equals, shall we say, has already established a Presbyterian form of government in the Church of Scotland. So the Church of Scotland is a Reformed church. So the Puritans have hope. And, when he comes down, they meet him and they present a number of petitions to him. He has a conference at Hampton Court, but it's evident from that conference that he doesn't really want to do anything. He recognizes that the parallel structure of the church and the state, with the king and the bishops at the top, is actually quite a good thing for him. The only thing that comes out of it is the King James Version of the Bible. Lots of things talked about, everything languages in committee. I'm sure you've heard of that before. So the other thing he does is he sends people to participate in the Synod of Dort to condemn Arminianism. His daughter is the wife of Frederick V the Palatinate. So if you ever go to Heidelberg, not that you should go, there's a giant castle that's a ruin now because it was destroyed in the 30 Years' War. However, one of the wing is the Elizabethan wing. His daughter, Elizabeth Stuart, is married to him. They build the wing and they establish English gardens at Heidelberg Castle that we're living today. In any case, so she becomes the Queen of Bohemia. He sees that this war is not going well, so he's naturally aligned to the Protestant cause and by marriage to the King of the Palatinate. But as this goes away, he doesn't want to get involved in this war. He starts to go away from Puritanism. So he shifts from, and he encourages in the church a shift from Calvinism to a more Arminian temperament. So this is where the Church of England starts to become more Arminian in its theology. Its focus shifts from the preaching moment to a greater focus on prayer and the sacrament. It is still opposed to Rome. It's strongly opposed to Rome, and it is committed to a kind of primitivism, what we call primitivism, whereby what becomes canonical, determinative for the life and practice of the church, is the first 5 centuries of church history. The leaders of this movement is William Laud, and the successor, Charles I, to James I, is moving even more in this direction. So Charles I marries a Roman Catholic, and he appoints Archbishop Laud, who had been consistently preaching against anything Puritanistic. He began to enforce high church Arminian sacramental orthodoxy on all the clergy. When Charles came to the throne, Laud gave him a list of all the clergy in the Church of England. And beside each name, there is either an O for Orthodox or a P for Puritan. And you can see that in a matter of years, everyone who had a P by their name, their career has tanked. And everyone who had an O by their name, their careers have gone through the roof. So this is a strong political move to make the Anglican Church more Catholic. So this is a process of defining a kind of orthodoxy in Catholicism. Now, all of this, as the king moves in more Catholic directions and Parliament becomes the center for Protestantism, you have a conflict between king and Parliament that ultimately results in the English Civil War. I'm not going to go through all the details of that, but when the Protestants have a number of victories, especially with Oliver Cromwell, who is an independent, they replace the Book of Common Prayer with a Directory of Worship. In 1646, the Church of England becomes a Presbyterian church. So, yeah, the Church of England was Presbyterian beginning in 1646 until the restoration of the monarchy, at least officially. So you have Parliament, which is dominated by Presbyterians. So I talked about, so Puritanism is not one thing. So there's Puritans who are actually Episcopalians who believe in bishops. There are Puritans who believe that we should have a president ruled by elders, and there's Puritans who believe every congregation should be independent. The leaders in Parliament were all majority Presbyterian Puritans. The leaders of the army, Cromwell established a new kind of army, which had every company become a gathered church. And this was an incredibly motivated fighting force, and what ultimately, made the difference in the war. What I have up here, though, is a picture of a woodcut, which has this pious woman in the midst of the Civil War praying while the king's forces, because they are dressed nicely, you can tell, are spearing one child on a skewer, and the Puritans are bashing her children's head against a rock. So what you have during this time period, similar in the 30 Years' War, is just massive destruction and disillusionment with church in general. You have all of these parties. The Puritans are fighting within themselves. There's a war between the Puritans and the High Church Anglicans, and there are still Roman Catholics living in England, in secret. Many of them, the sort of high nobility who can afford to hide priests on their staff as chaplains. Within all of this chaos, a number of groups emerge that are even, more radical. Baptists are Puritans who have gone over to the Netherlands and become influenced by Anabaptists and come back. So they don't take the peace part, but they take the adult baptism part back with them. Because of the chaos of the Civil War, all the restrictions on publishing are gone. So people have one historian put, there was no one way to error, like the streams crisscross. People could believe in infant baptism and be peace tradition. They could, all sorts of different ways of mixing these things up. Quakers emerge at this time because there's a number of folks who just want to drop out of religion altogether, and they're known as seekers. And Fox, has a vision to just go out and begin preaching, and that you don't need to follow any of these externals, this orthodoxy, whatever. You need to follow the inner life. There's also a number of apocalyptic sects, like the Fifth Monarchists, who believe this is all in preparation for Jesus becoming the fifth king. Muggletonians. There's a whole bunch of Muggles. I wonder if that's where that comes from. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of different sects that emerge in all this time period. In 1649, Charles I is captured, and he's also beheaded. This is radical, because to execute the king, regicide was just considered an incredible sin, because this is you got to think about yourself from a medieval perspective. The king was given by God. So this is human beings saying, the leader you put over us, God, we're rejected. So when this happened, we think about this as the culmination of the victory of the Protestants, the Puritans. When it happened, people rushed forward with their handkerchiefs to mop up the blood, to save it as a relic, as Charles was considered a martyr by huge portions of the population.
Why would he make it?
Because they wanted to get rid of the king.
Yeah.
He lost the war. That's why. Death happens in war. Yeah, that's why. But it's more significant because he's the king. After he is executed, Oliver Cromwell, who had led the armies, the ones that were the New Model Army, as it was called, the ones that were gathered in church groups, becomes the Lord Protector. And basically, as Lord Protector, he is theoretically supposed to enforce official Presbyterianism throughout the Church of England, but he's not a Presbyterian, and he couldn't care less. And so he encourages any kind of religious independency while he's, during the 5 years that he is Lord Protector. So religion is in the midst is chaotic. Let's just put it that way. I don't have a picture of it, but things are so bad that Exeter Cathedral, which is this beautiful cathedral in Exeter, during this period, they actually built a wall separating the nave of the church from the choir, because those were, both relatively the same size. It's just a visible indication of the division of the church, and I can't remember which is which, but the Presbyterians worshipped on one side, and the Congregationalists worshipped on the other. So the cathedral itself was divided architecturally with a wall. And if you ever go to Middelburg, I know you're not going to go there, but in Middelburg, in the Netherlands, there is still a church, a Protestant church, that was the Cathedral of Middelburg, with the wall still down the middle. And they still have two separate congregations after however many years. You can't see, I couldn't tell the difference between the two if you wanted to, but they still maintain two separate congregations in the cathedral. So that's the level of division that was going on. So Cromwell leaves, his son is not any good at leading, and Parliament decides, we need the king back. Charles II, who is Charles I's son, who had been sent to France for his safety, and which was a good thing because his father was beheaded, is called back. And look at this guy and think about what you think of when you think of French royalty. It's the model that he is bringing back with him from France is the model of absolute monarchy. I mean, he looks like Louis or whatever. Okay. So when he comes back, Puritanism, which is scary and is utterly rejected. The Book of Common Prayer, the Articles of Religion, and the homilies are restored. As a clergy person, you had to accept these documents without actually seeing them. So,
wow.
Yep. And you had to receive it. So lots of people were ordained as clergy but not by a bishop because there were no bishops, right? So you then had to accept these documents unexamined, and you had to receive a new ordination, which is to say you reject your old ordination. There were lots of people who couldn't make that adjustment. And this is, so when you think about the politics, people with what we're going to talk about as pietistic sensibilities about what it really means to be a Christian might fall on either side of those two things. You know what I'm saying? Like, I could be a pietist and still be willing to be ordained by a bishop. Most of you, those of you are Methodists. And I could be a pietist and be willing to use the Book of Common Prayer, or I could be a pietist and say, you know what, I was ordained by a group of elders, and I've been serving in the church for this many years. I'm just as ordained. I'm ordained. Whatever. I'm not having another ordination. I mean, it is in that purging of pulpits in England after Charles II comes that both of John Wesley's grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and his grandfather, both his grandfathers and one great-grandfather were thrown out of the ministry. His grandfather on his mother's side, Samuel Annesley, was the rector of St. Giles Cripplegate, which was a very important church in London. So, and he was considered a very influential Puritan, because you are a Puritan if you refuse to do this. So, think of when we think about pietistic movements in England, there are two kinds really that are developing in the midst of this turmoil. One is a reformed version of pietistic Puritanism, and the other is a Arminian version, which is Arminian and sacramental, out of which emerges what's known as the religious societies movement. I'm just going to go through some of these quick. English Puritanism, we're going to be talking about some of these folks. You have folks like Pietism, Puritan Pietism, John Bunyan. The focus of Pilgrim Progress is it's all about the way of salvation. Right? Mm-hmm. It's not about what vestments you should wear. It's not about whether you should be a Presbyterian or a Congregationalist or and he himself is an independent, which means Congregationalist usually. And Richard Baxter was an incredibly important cleric. In fact, he was offered a bishopric when Charles II comes to power, but he refused because he wasn't going to receive episcopal ordination. And he prepared a revised prayer book at that settlement to try and sort of bring, instead of saying here it's the Book of Common Prayer or nothing, maybe we can, have something in between. That does not win the day. He loses that battle. But he's also very noted for the use of small groups. I'll talk about that. And then, I don't actually want to talk about home ec right now. What time we got?
3:45.
15 minutes. So these are some of the people. So Hornak, we'll talk about, we'll read some of him. That's the religious Anglican societies. I'm going to go back and pick up a little bit with back on the continent. So you have that war. You have the war in England, you have a crisis of authority, and you really have strong monarchic power that asserts what is the orthodoxy of the church. On the continent, things are a little more confusing. You have a crisis of authority after the 30 Years' War. Revelation is not able to provide the assumptions for the society because there's no common understanding that crosses ethnic lines and socioeconomic lines. So if you're a Saxon Christian, you think one thing. If you're a Bavarian Christian, you think another thing. This is the beginning in the modern period. We mark the beginning of modernity from 1648, from the end of the 30 Years' War. And so you have an attempt to provide universal assumptions to undergird society. And this is the beginning of what we call secularism. So you have secular philosophical options. Those are mostly on the continent, skeptical reason, Descartes, and you have empirical data, scientific method, etc. That's most popular in England. You also have religious options, and one of the religious options is regional orthodoxies. So you have the Orthodox Party who wants to define Christianity by a set of orthodox principles. So you are a Christian if you believe in plenary inspiration of the Holy Scriptures. If you believe that the Holy Scriptures are inerrant in their original autographs, you are there. That defines you as that is an orthodox. You can check that off. That would be an orthodox sort of statement of how we define what Christian is. And this was, largely enforced by the state at the state church level. Of course, folks who are in this camp don't like that camp very much, right? They're rebelling against, and so some of the conflict between science and religion is beginning to emerge that we lived through in the modern period. The second is to define Christianity by a voluntary, again, the whole agency issue, experiential religion that results in accountable communities. And this movement begins to reinvigorate the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. And most of these folks stay in their state churches, but they aren't defined by their state churches. They'll use the language of whatever their regional orthodoxy is, that can also be Roman Catholic, to express their piety, but they recognize each other across orthodox lines. So you have the end of the 30 Years' War, and you have the Reformation, and you have a situation where you have orthodoxy in place. You have people moving to wherever fits their orthodoxy, and yet people are still living like heathen. I mean, we've established what is true doctrine, and nonetheless, people are not living. We don't have a godly society. So the emergence of pietism, at least from my perspective, is largely along this Rhine River. Now, Johann Arndt is actually a very early stage. He's actually over here, also along the river, mind you. But it is in these areas, and of course Brandenburg, this area is also Reformed, Calvinist. it's in these areas that you have these centers of Calvinism. So in Switzerland, in the Palatinate, and in the Netherlands. And so you have these orthodoxies that have a very strong concern for the doctrine of sanctification. On top of that, the Rhine River becomes a kind of border of confessions. So you have France on the one side, which is mostly Roman Catholic. You have Lutheranism here, you have Calvinism here and along it, and this is the main trade route. This is the way you get from the mountains to the sea. So you have merchants and everybody else is meeting here with their various confessions, and in order to just get along, perhaps, or whatever, they begin to use some of the language of making a distinction between fundamentals and opinions. You know, what is fundamental to Christianity and what can we let that be your opinion and this will be my opinion. So next week we'll talk about this a little bit further, but I'll just introduce it. So there's this concern that the Reformation needs to be worked out in the lives of people. It's not enough to just have it up here. There's a sanctification issue. There's an issue of experience, that is a part of it. There's an eschatological aspect of it, that the work of the Holy Spirit that's going on in me is also going on in the society. And the use of small groups, which basically one sort of marker for a pietistic organization. Are they cultivating piety in small groups? And that's one of the markers. So anyway, that I think we it's 3:50 right now, and we're supposed to end at 3:50, and I can tell John when is done. So, any last minute thoughts or questions about some of the history, the relationship between Orthodoxy, war, and the emergence of pietism? You guys?
One of them.
Yeah. And God comes out of it. That's the amazing thing.
I mean,
it just seems like, if there was no God, it seems like that would be a good time for Christianity to give up.
Just die.
Yeah. But out of it comes this whole new movement of life. It's pretty amazing.
It is. I agree. That's why it's one of my favorite things to study, because it really put into paper, in 16